we're going to talk about the two gentlemen who are names you see there, George Petrie and George Dunoyer. George Petrie, nowadays people often say Petrie. It's Petrie or Petrie. But when he was alive, it was Petrie. So nowadays people have altered the pronunciation. And he's late 18th, but well into the 19th century. And George Dunoyer, a little bit younger, but not very much younger. How are they connected? George Dunoyer, George Victor Dunoyer, was the pupil of George Petrie, the artist. And so they're connected in that way. They're also connected in that George Victor Dunoyer worked for George Petrie in the Ordnance Survey of Ireland. And that's a kind of key episode in Irish cultural history, scientific history too. The Ordnance Survey was initiated 1824 by Thomas Spring Rice, an MP for Limerick. It was a parliamentary commission, and the concept came about that the Royal Engineers would come to Ireland and would map the entire country on a scale of 6 inches to 1 mile, which is a colossally detailed scale for the time. The Ordnance Survey had been proceeding in England already, but it was 1 inch to 1 mile. So to do a country in 6 inches to 1 mile was a colossal undertaking, and the Royal Engineers and the Corps of Sappers and Miners were detailed to do this work. Mapping was important in terms not only of strategic development and infrastructure, but also for military reasons. The original Ordnance Survey in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain, evolved after the Jacobite Rebellion in Scotland, 1745, when they discovered really they had no maps of the Scottish Highlands, so they did not know how they were going to find their enemy. And so that was when mapping of Scotland began, and it was begun by engineers from the army. And that whole thing then evolved. But then they were mapping throughout England, and they were doing so for the development of railways and roads, and also particularly for geology. 1835, the Geological Survey of Britain is founded, and perhaps only 5 years, little more after that, in Ireland, the Geological Survey of Ireland is established. But the mapping of Ireland by the Ordnance Survey, which proceeded from 1824 to 1840, thereabouts, was a world first. Ireland is one of the best mapped countries in the world because of this, because they put so much government money and resources into it. Not only were they going to put government money into the mapping, the producing of 47 of these large-scale maps, but also they were going to publish memoirs, and the memoirs were going to be full of information on natural history, on culture, on music, on geology, on plants, animals of these areas. So it became something I think that was very much inspired by French encyclopedists of the 18th century, Diderot and so on. And in terms of that idea, it's worth considering that, this whole enterprise is connected with the development of technology. And I was chatting earlier with Clint about memory. and you see, the whole business of mapping is when data, call it scientific data, measured data, replaces memory, which is an oral tradition. So the play Translations by Brian Friel. So that play is based upon the Corps of Miners and Sappers and Engineers in County Donegal and the work that they were doing in replacing a poetic oral cultural tradition that was not written down but simply handed, from one person to the other by speech and memory, was being replaced by a paper-based system of recording this information and also codifying it and also standardizing the spelling of place names. So the spelling of place names in Ireland has been a contentious issue for a long time. and still it is today, because so many of the spellings when you drive around Ireland are so grotesque that you just really think, who could abide this? They're just travesties. The play was called Translations. It should have been called Travesties. No, that's Tom Stoppard. And why were they so bad? Well, they're so bad for many reasons. Now, it's not because Brian Friel in his play characterizes the English sappers as being completely ignorant and unsympathetic concerning local people and their pronunciation and the ancient history that they had of the places that they knew so well. But the situation was really complicated, because when they went there, they actually found that 10 different people might have 10 different names for one place. And there were variations, and some people on one side of a hill would call it one thing and the others would call it another thing, and some would describe one place as in terms of one name. So the standardization itself was an important thing. Petrie was employed by the Ordnance Survey to head up the topographical department from the 1830 or thereabouts onwards. And his role was to run an office in which he would employ people like John O'Donovan and Eugene Curry and even James Clarence Mangan, the poet, and they would walk the highways and byways of Ireland collecting the oral information. In particular, John O'Donovan put a prodigious amount of work into this, and his place name books are still an incredible repository of information on what people in various parts of Ireland identified, their locale, the features of the landscape, and to the best of their ability, those were then translated into the maps. But they didn't have, O'Donovan could only do so much. And also the funding for that topographical department and the memoirs that were to be produced along with the maps, that was cut. And instead of memoirs being produced for every single one of these big 6-inch maps, there were only one memoir was finally published. That was a memoir for Templemore in Derry. So they're at these two artists then occupy the cusp between an old tradition, an older sort of tradition, and a new, more scientific approach. And George Petrie is depicted here by his father. His father was Scottish, came to Ireland. They were Presbyterian and nonconformist. And that's quite important, because we talked about that before in terms of the history of Ireland. Nonconformists coming from Scotland were not inclined to be so, they were inclined to be rebellious, independent, looking for principles of liberty, and so on. James Petrie and the Petrie family, or the Petrie family, no exception. And in fact, James Petrie, among his miniatures or among his portraits that survive, are some sketches he made of Robert Emmet in the courtroom when Robert Emmet was being tried for his rebellion in the early 19th century. So George was born into a relatively middle-class home in Dublin, and he attended White's Academy off Grafton Street. Long gone, but White's Academy was quite important. Thomas Moore also studied there. And, it was, again, one of these academies that had a tradition which was not necessarily fully in conformity with the view from Dublin Castle. It was White's Academy. I won't call it a hotbed of rebellion, but a lot of the students who went from there to Trinity College were quite radical in their outlook. The view of antiquities in Ireland and the view of the landscape in Ireland prior to the period when Petrie and Dunoyer and others begin to work, it's one which is characterized by this painting. It's by Maria Spilsbury Taylor. It's in the National Gallery, and it shows a context, if you like, within which the antiquities of Ireland are a sort of backdrop, a fanciful backdrop to the everyday, forgive the quality of the image, but what you're looking at is a festival of St. Kevin in Glendalough in County Wicklow. And Maria Spilsbury Taylor, along with quite a number of artists, would have just used these antiquities such as round towers or monasteries or cromlechs, dolmens, these megalithic tombs that we now know are Neolithic, and stone circles and standing stones. They would have used those sort of backdrops. There were a lot of fanciful ideas about what vintage these antiquities were. So the Irish landscape, in its physical characteristics, such as rivers and mountains, was one thing, but you also had a landscape that was peppered with the remains of earlier cultures, Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age. And in the late 18th century, the Royal Irish Academy is founded, 1780s. Remember, we saw the portrait of the Earl of Charlemont, who was the first president of the Royal Irish Academy. And one of the early members was a chap called Charles Valency, who we'll look at in a second. And Gabriel Béranger, who painted this view, and a lot of other similar views, which are in the library of the Royal Irish Academy still today, came from the Netherlands, as indeed we've seen in the previous talks, along with so many other artists coming from the Netherlands, and perhaps even less so from England, but very many from the Netherlands to work in Ireland. And Gabriel Béranger surveys the dolmen around 1780. And this is the beginning of a more scientific approach to looking at these things, instead of just calling them, Danish tombs or giants' graves or whatever. They're beginning to classify them into different sections, different categories. And this is the work that's carried out by the Royal Irish Academy. The Royal Irish Academy still is a major institution and force in Irish culture today. And they moved to their present headquarters in 1851. And it promotes science and the arts and a whole range of things. So it's an incredible institution today. George Petrie was the curator of the Academy's museum because they were collecting antiquities. And he also was responsible for securing manuscripts, including the Annals of the Four Masters, for the library of the Academy, which is still one of its great treasures. Petrie was a procrastinator, and he never really got anything finished as he meant to, and people constantly complained about him taking too long. He was too diligent, he was too exacting. When he failed to complete the catalogue, so William Wilde came in and did the job very quickly. This is the father of Oscar Wilde, Sir William Wilde, who was a well-known antiquary and writer in Dublin, and whose wife was named Speranza, and she was a great poet and dressed in a very dramatic way, and they had conversaciones in their house. And there was a strong radical element running through that family too, as you can imagine, not least with young Oscar himself. And so William Wilde and George Petrie and William Stokes, another well-known medical doctor, come writer, come antiquarian, Margaret Stokes, an archaeologist and antiquarian, Samuel Ferguson, these form a nexus, which is a very, very powerful one of scientifically minded very progressive thinking, Dublin, middle class, Protestant families who give their lives to science and the arts and give their lives to dedicate them to, geology, botany, and so on. And the institutions that you find in Dublin today are their legacy. And they were extraordinarily talented and very ambitious. And they replaced gentlemen like Charles Valency, who, for all his ambition and acumen and skill, and he was very skilled, sort of made a bit of a hames of interpreting Irish antiquities and also the whole history of Ireland. He basically cooked up an imaginary history of Ireland, and he published many volumes in pursuit of his dream, which was to prove that Ireland had been colonized by Egyptians back in the days of the pyramids. That's Valency. He was actually a military engineer, and he designed Spike Island, and that's a fairly considerable. We saw the other star-shaped fort at Kinsale that had been erected in the decades after the Battle of Kinsale, and this is not far away, and this was more connected with the Napoleonic era, because there was a Napoleonic wars that forced an inward looking, when Napoleon had cut France off to English and Irish visitors, England became inward looking, and people found the Lake District, they found the Scottish Highlands, they found Snowdonia in Wales, they found the lakes of Killarney, they found those spots that are today enormously celebrated in town, very popular in terms of tourism, but in those days were backwaters or forgotten about or unknown. So the good old Napoleon Bonaparte has an important and sort of silent role to play in this talk tonight, because part of the inward looking aspect involved a re-evaluation. We saw in the 17th and 18th century, it was de rigueur, the grand tour was de rigueur for any young person to go, if they were wealthy, to go to Rome, to go to Paris and to study and so on. But with that cut off, it meant that there was suddenly an increased attention on what was available, to put it in one way, in one's own backyard. So, but Valency was undaunted by any quibbles. His illustrious membership of the Royal Irish Academy isn't, I have to say, exactly celebrated by the Academy today, because his views were so skewed on so many aspects. But he was, I suppose, quickly enough unmasked, and it was George Petrie who did that. And one can only sort of have a certain fond regard for Valency, who quickly compared the Round Tower at Ardmore in County Waterford with the Round Tower in India, and thus proving that the Round Towers of Ireland were Zoroastrian fire temples, and probably used for human sacrifice too. And but he was diligent, and he really did try and document an enormous number of remains in Ireland, if you like, artifacts in Ireland that had previously been overlooked. The Ogham alphabet cut into those rocks is important in this series. This is from Kilmalcader in County Kerry, and again Ardmore. But this Ogham, or Ogham, O-G-H-A-M, it's not so much an alphabet as a code. So on a crude standing stone, using a code of horizontal or diagonal cuts made with a chisel or other instrument, the cuts refer to a Latin letter. So this is a succinct memorial to somebody who has died. It's crude and primitive in a way, but the coding system in its minimalism is quite sophisticated. And this Ogham code is what Brian O'Doherty has used. So in the last lecture in this series, we'll be looking at a contemporary conceptual art piece made by a leading contemporary artist, but based upon this Ogham alphabet. It's difficult to date it, you know, maybe 4th, 5th, 6th century AD, around maybe a little bit later, around that time, and made by people who had some Latin and were able to, you know, were concerned to memorialize the dead. Valency again, looking at Egyptian hieroglyphs and trying to compare them to the Ogham alphabet. But you can see he is making progress here, because he has done work in identifying the letters that these strokes in the stone refer to, and translating it, you see, as best he can, and relating it then to the statue of Isis in Egypt. Be nice if it was true. It would be marvelous. Unfortunately, it's you know, like so much antiquarianism, it's so fanciful. But nonetheless, Valency's collectanea, as he called it, encompasses a huge range of material, including this Neolithic passage grave at Newgrange, which when he saw it was this, you know, mound, a large mound of earth. And you can see in the cross section people crawling in through the passageway to the chamber at the center. These tombs are now, there's a complex of them on the River Boyne, have been shown to be older than the pyramids of Egypt, so they're quite early. And the method of construction is not dissimilar to some of the early pyramids too. So you could see why Valency was going this way. You know, if you've been into the early pyramids, the way they corbel that stone is not dissimilar. But nonetheless, and how romantic it was for these antiquarians, you know, because when these antiquarians in the 18th century are beginning to discover Newgrange and other passage graves and other remains of thousands of years before, they found them almost untouched, whereas throughout Europe, you know, these had been long since, such remains had long since been celebrated. So Ireland was a sort of, in a way, a frontier for such investigations, and they threw themselves upon the subject with relish. The stones are still there today. Many of you may know this site. Those antiquarians, and even Valency, in their most earnest efforts, did very little damage to them. I think it was the Irish government that decided to comprehensively vandalize Newgrange and transform it from the photograph that you saw previously to this thing, which looks like it might house a space-age golf club and is constructed of reinforced concrete. And but it does have the passage grave inside it, and you know, the passage grave itself and the passage leading to it in the tomb has all been reconstructed and strengthened and so on. But I doubt very much if Neolithic man in Ireland or woman would have seen what they see now. We must move on quickly. It's too horrible to look at. But the stones are still there today in this reconstructed entrance area. Newgrange is famous because on the winter solstice, the sunlight, which is just at that point, at that time of year, at the shortest day of the year, penetrates through the box above the, all the way down the passage into the inner. So many people, you know, apply years in advance to go and sit in the central chamber now they're almost invariably disappointed because the weather's almost invariably cloudy and there's no sunlight. But it's a sort of rite of passage. And this is an impressive body of men, and these are the Royal Engineers, and these are the chaps who were delegated with the task of mapping Ireland. And they have got their theodolites and all of the other instruments that they would need for that task. And they had to work in all sorts of weather and conditions, and incurring a degree of hostility too, because people in Ireland did not like mapping. They associated mapping with taxes, and not unreasonably, because most of the people who had been carrying out mapping were doing so in order to impose taxes such as tithes. And the instruments that they used were part of this transition from the, if you like, more intuitive or sort of sense-based, surveying to a far more scientific. This chart shows the Ramsden surveying equipment. It was the Jesse Ramsden, who devised this theodolite that could measure distance and altitude and so on of features to within inches over miles. And that is what they used, an 18-inch theodolite. So this is what those chaps were dragging around the country. And the maps that they produced, this is one of them, were then used by Dunoyer and the Geological Survey to chart every single little detail that they could of the geology of the country. So this is a 6-inch map. They called them field sheets, and they were given to the surveyors from the Geological Survey, which was a part of in England of the Ordnance Survey. And the surveyors then would go around with the 6-inch maps that included details of buildings in great detail. No other country, as I say, I think has or was or has been mapped in this way. Ferreter's Cove, you can see, it's a part of the Kerry coastline. And this is a field sheet that Dunoyer was given when he was a geologist, a geological surveyor, and this is his writing over it. And what we're leaving behind is this. We're leaving behind the picturesque in a way. We're leaving behind the 18th century with the copper plate engravings, those beautiful sensitive aquatints and mezzotints, which were printed on large sheets of copper and which were intended for aristocratic audiences. This is by Jonathan Fisher, and it's 1789, and he's one of the last of these wonderful aquatinters who were producing these folios of large-scale prints. And what we're moving from there, we're moving into steel plate engraving, moving from copper to steel. And this is a book, Thomas Kitson Cromwell's Excursions Through Ireland, published in 3 volumes, and it's illustrated by George Petrie, because George Petrie is making a living in the early 1820s, in the 3 or 4 years before he joins the Ordnance Survey. From about 1820 onwards, he's trying to make a living as an artist in Dublin. He's showing some watercolors in the Royal Hibernian Academy. He's selling some. He's also doing this work because there's this boom in tourism that I mentioned, means there's a huge demand. There's also a rising middle class. So the 18th century social and cultural world has changed. It's now much more recognizable as a contemporary world in which guidebooks, so these are the predecessors of Dorling Kindersley, or what's the French company? Hachette, is it, who do Hachette, who do the guidebooks, yeah. And so this is early Hachette. And they're steel engravings, and because they're engraved on steel, you can print 5,000 copies. A copper plate will only survive maybe 100 impressions. So copper plate etchings and aquatints, they're rare, they're expensive, they're very much for aristocratic, wealthy collectors. Steel plate, these are so ubiquitous that they're still sold commonly, taken out of these books and sold individually in frames, and not expensive even today. They're produced in such numbers. The volumes in this had 119 of engravings, of which 97 were produced by George Petrie, and they were mainly around Dublin, but he also went down the Shannon in 1820. And the way in which these books were published was in series as it went along, and if the first one sold, then the second one would immediately be put on the front on the front foot, as it were. And sometimes Petrie didn't get paid. Sometimes they didn't sell so well. He was involved in a number of such publications. But you can see the precision of George Petrie's work as an artist in this view of the medieval church of Christ Church in Dublin. We saw, you remember, the marriage of Strongbow and Aoife. Mm-hmm. Well, this is a church where the tomb of Strongbow is famously contained. You can go there today and see this tomb. Of course, it's not his tomb. It's the tomb of some other medieval knight, because I think the roof collapsed and smashed the real one. So they quickly whisked out another one from reserve, and that's what people look at today. And Petrie shows it amidst the characteristic, Dublin landscape. But he got there just before the whiskey millionaires got there. And when William Rowe, who had made a fortune in whiskey, had finished sponsoring the rebuilding of Christ Church, he had produced and funded what is now really a Victorian building. So you're looking at the same building from the same view, and you see how completely changed it is. It's got all these marvelous flying buttresses and windows, facade, everything completely changed. There are, I think, 18,000 floor tiles in this wonderful medieval cathedral. Every single one of them, I believe, is Victorian. So what they did was they simply recreated this idea of a medieval cathedral in the Gothic sense, inspired by the idea. But there we are. Even in 1820, they believed that was Strongbow's tomb, monument. Yeah. And what Petrie really wanted to do as an artist was he wanted to be like the Irish Turner. His spirit inclined toward the sublime, and you see it expressed here. We saw it in the paintings of George Barrett, and we discussed it in relation to Edmund Burke's treatise, Inquiry into our origins of our understanding of the beautiful and the sublime. And you can see in this Killiney and Dalkey Island steel engraving after a watercolor by Petrie that his aspiration was in that direction, and his aspiration was also in the direction of the antiquities of Ireland, of which he was enamored. And I think this is possibly the same cromlech, as they called them in those days, that was drawn by Gabriel Béranger in the 18th century and measured. And he traveled around Ireland, Petrie did, with his watercolor set. And in terms of the technology, it's important to remember that Wattman paper was now available. That's that paper. It's similar to Arches paper that you still buy today. And Wattman in England you still buy today. But this was the time when Wattman paper was first becoming available, and a portable watercolor set was first becoming available too. Prior to this, artists worked in their studio because they had to mix colors and they had all the material and impedimenta. Now you had portability, they could travel. And this led to that whole revolution in watercolor painting, which is really found its greatest exponents in the Norwich School in England, and which is not it's not a coincidence that it's closely linked with the military people like Sandby and others who learnt their craft while they were serving in the army, because the mapping of a landscape was a most important part of an officer's training through the 17th century and the 18th century. An enormous number of scientific and cultural advances came about through the activities of people who liked to fire guns at one another. Newton's reflections upon gravity, largely prompted by trying to work out the trajectory of a cannonball that's ejected at speed and gradually returns to the earth. These were important questions if you wanted to kill large numbers of people efficiently. And artists and others then took up from them. So Petrie takes it up, and he's looking at here Drogheda, and his antiquarian and his historic interest brings him to one of the gates of the old walled town of Drogheda. A defensive structure, and outside it, the little cabins, this clear division, if you like, between the military stronghold and those outside it. The housing has improved since, yes. Yeah, but the gate still remains, and it's rather like where we are here now, that underneath the Rue Soufflot, you'll find the old walls of Paris. They're remembered only, I think, in Port Saint-Jacques, but here, not far from here, were giant walls, turrets, and towers protecting the walls of Paris. This is not dissimilar in a much smaller scale, obviously. And so Petrie, he's traveling constantly, and that's quite a new thing, and he's using new modes of transport. The canals have been opened up across Ireland, so you can travel by canal from Dublin to the Shannon and then out to the west of Ireland. So he's using all of that, and he's traveling, collecting information as he goes along. And this is Kells, where the Book of Kells came from. The Book of Kells that is now in Trinity College. They had to bring it in, otherwise it probably wouldn't have survived a raid that was impending upon that outlying town of the English Pale. And this is Petrie's watercolor of Kells, upon which the engravers would base their work. And you can detect when these watercolors are intended for the engravers. They're generally monochrome. They're not highly colored. They might be in sepia, just one or two colors. Remember, we saw the portrait of Hugh O'Neill that had been brought back from Rome by Lord Dunsany, and it was to adorn Dunsany Castle here in County Westmeath. Another book that Petrie worked for was George Newnham Wright's Historical Guide to Ancient and Modern Dublin. G.N. Wright, very talented man, extraordinary. He actually worked for a good number of years in Ireland, but then went abroad, and he produced such books concerning different parts of the world. He traveled widely in the end, G.N. Wright. But when he was in Dublin, he was the headmaster of a school called the Proprietary School, and it was that Proprietary School, which is on Great Denmark Street, which we'll see in a little while, that George Dunoyer was a pupil. And that was where George Petrie was a teacher of art. So that's where Dunoyer's talent was first discovered by Petrie. And it was through Newnham Wright's school. But Newnham Wright, in addition to his teaching work, was producing these guides, and they're excellent, 1821. And Petrie is producing these watercolors for the engravers. You see how delicate this is. So this is sent to London, where the engravers, a most difficult group of men, intractable, critical. They keep writing back and saying, oh, Petrie's work, oh, he doesn't have enough figures. They're lifeless. We want more activity. They wanted Petrie to put the names of the shops above the shops so that the shopkeepers would be interested in buying the books. And he was asked to insert figures and so all of these things were sort of anathema to George Petrie, because he'd been schooled in the Dublin Society Drawing School. He'd absorbed all of the lessons of the picturesque and the sublime, and now he was being asked to put in figures in the courtyard to liven up these views. It was pedestrian work, but they made a very good job of it. They are superb engravings, and they show Trinity College and Francis Johnson's extension to the old Parliament building, which since the Act of Union in 1800 had become the Bank of Ireland, as it still is today. And these steel engravings of Dublin in the early 1820s are fantastic. And Petrie did achieve a wonderful, wonderful result with them. St. Patrick's Cathedral, also reconstructed again on the basis of the profits made from the sale of alcohol, in this case Guinness. Yes, so Benjamin Guinness. And again, mostly Victorian, the original largely gone. The forecourts. And the drawing for them. He was an extraordinarily delicate artist. And as I say, took immense pains to get things right. He was very good, not only in terms of his visual art, but also in terms of the precision with which he was recording the antiquities of Ireland as he travelled. And the vicissitudes of this business are identified very clearly in that date, 1825. This is a book that appeared 4 years late. And Petrie was being besieged with requests from the publishers and the engravers for seats of the nobility and gentry. Again, because they'd buy copies. He wanted landscapes, he wanted vistas. He wanted to include, but they kept, driving him towards the what's the word? They kept driving him towards not the mundane, but the mercenary imperatives of the publication drove them towards producing views like this of Carton, the Duke of Leinster. One of those families descended from the Boyles that we looked at in an earlier talk. Carton today has been made, I think into a golf club, yeah. But the house itself has been preserved. And the original watercolor by Petrie is really, again, superb and light and delicate, and he's included his figures, so hopefully the engravers were satisfied. As he travelled, he came upon towns such as Kilmallock in County Limerick, towns that had formerly been places of considerable importance, with monasteries and bishoprics and all sorts of things, but which by Petrie's time were, I suppose he depicts it accurately enough there, with the roads looking like a Boulevard Saint-Germain today, and awash with water, all the drains blocked. And remember, we looked at this early map of Kilmallock, and that shows that town, and it shows that King John's Castle, like so many others, a castle attributed to King John, attributed to the period of the Anglo-Norman invasion, when Strongbow came and was quickly followed by Henry II, trying to put manners on him. And today, still there. So interesting, these towns, these Irish towns, are, painted in all these lurid colors now, and in some cases to great effect and great cheerfulness, in other cases to, less so, we'll say. But behind those Victorian stuccoed facades, very often the earlier buildings survive, or the structures of earlier buildings survive. And you'll find that with very many Irish towns, there are 17th century buildings, 18th century, behind Victorian facades. And he's in Glendalough. Glendalough, being close enough to Dublin, was a famous place for the initial forays of tourists, and Petrie had, you know, responded to that with his early work of depicting Glendalough, which was from 1815. It's one of the first paintings that he exhibited in the Royal Hibernian Academy. And Parsonstown Castle, we saw members of the Ross family, the Earl of Ross, and remember the chap who founded the Hellfire Club in Askeaton from this place. This is the castle where there's that telescope which was to be drawn by Dunoyer. And Clonmacnoise on the banks of the Shannon with its 7 churches and round towers, exciting the imagination of antiquarians, but Petrie's view of it includes a little funeral taking place. His watercolour, this is a late watercolour, sums up his career, and was intended as such. It was painted for the Art Union to be translated into an engraving, but like so many things in his life, I'm not sure that it ever was translated into an engraving. So you see the bank of the Shannon River there, you see the sun setting. The sun is setting in a metaphorical way upon the old Gaelic civilization. You see the old man being led by a child and woman up the hill. You see the grave slabs at Clonmacnoise. Those are there today in a museum beside the monastery, and those grave slabs are part of Petrie's own scholarly researches, and he published a book upon them. The round tower which dominates the whole view is again relates to another publication by Petrie called The Ecclesiastical Architecture of Ireland Anterior to the Anglo-Norman Invasion. And the High Cross people, you know, are crowding around it, and in the background a castle that had been actually demolished by Cromwell during the wars of the 17th century. So this is the Celtic twilight, literally rendered in a visual form. So as the century, then the 19th century, reaches its conclusion, and as the 20th century emerges, you have works like this defining and codifying in a visual sense what people came to understand as the Celtic twilight, which Yeats made so much of with his writings, and which also John Millington Synge and others you know, were very much inspired by. Under the care of the Office of Public Works, it lacks the romance, we might say today, but it is very well looked after and preserved. A more prosaic scene. You can see how much Petrie had embellished it. But he did so within the realms of scientific precision. And his books were very strongly advocating a properly researched, properly academically, you know, verified view of what these buildings were, what dates they were, and what their purposes were too. So you might know in Glasnevin Cemetery, the round tower there, which is the memorial to Daniel O'Connell, that was designed by Petrie late in his life. Like so many other aspects of his life, it was a bit of a disaster from his point of view, because they ran out of money. And so they put the body of Daniel O'Connell into the round tower. This is a travesty, because Valency had said, oh, they're tombs. People said these are tombs and fire towers and Zoroastrians, all that sort of thing. Petrie had established that they were not, that they were watchtowers and bell towers and were not used for funerary purposes. So at the last thing in his life, he designs this memorial to Daniel O'Connell. The money runs out. They can't finish the mortuary thing beside it, so in goes the corpse of O'Connell, and you know, that's life. But his watercolors, many have private collections, many drawings in the National Gallery, are wonderful evocations of landscapes that have long since been, you know, trammeled by highways and motorways. The approaches to Killarney, are full of the grandeur of those rugged mountains, but the road that leads into Killarney now would traverse through the centre of this painting. And Mona Incha in County Tipperary, very detailed and precise view of the Romanesque facade of that church. And through his engravings and through his work and his publications, Petrie was one of those people in the early 19th century who was very much responsible for the evolution of the Hiberno-Romanesque style of architecture. And he paid great reverence to country people and their devotion to those sites of religious. So he was collecting material from oral tradition. He also collected music and actually published a book on the early music of Ireland that was extremely important. In Gouvernement, this watercolour of a place of religious pilgrimage in the West Cork, northwest Cork at Gouvernement, where the River Lee rises, he does achieve a degree of what you can perfectly, contentedly describe as the sublime, with the shaft of sunlight coming down and the grandeur of the mountains around the hermitage of St. Finbar. He worked in a time when John O'Donovan was translating the Annals of the Old Master, and they were being published by the Royal Irish Academy, all these old manuscripts from the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, which contained within them the lives of saints going back further, and which were this extraordinary repository for fact and fable, and also a great deal of material evidence about the situation and culture in Ireland in the first 1,000 years, AD. And so John O'Donovan was who became a professor at Queen's University in Belfast, was probably the main scholar involved with that. But nowadays, of course, when you talk to academics, they will say, well, there was no St. Finbar, and there were 3 St. Patricks, and these saints are entirely invented. They were invented in the Norman times to justify and vindicate the lordships of various people. So we have to, unfortunately, I believe, to consign St. Finbar and his hermitage into the realms of fancy, but that was all to come later. In Petrie's time, there was an implicit belief in the veracity of so many of those lives of saints. And he explored the Connemara. Nowadays, of course, if you are from France and you have not been to Connemara, you're missing out. But he was one of the first to go there and to depict the rugged grandeur of the 12 Bens. And Killarney too. Killarney again, an important destination with the lakes of Killarney. And a lot of the work that he did in, say, this stone circle in County Derry, there's no vestige of this left today. So his watercolors are an important record of many things that have, some things, not many things, but a good number of things that have disappeared. And Dunangus on the Aran Islands, I think after Connemara, the Aran Islands is a must-see destination, and he was there painting Dunangus with its chevaux de frise you see on the right, and then this fortress on the left overlooking the Atlantic, which, of course, in a mythical or metaphorical way, could have been seen to represent like the last stand of Irish Celtic civilization from the onslaught of the forces of modernization. So that's George Petrie. And that's a portrait of him by his student, George Dunoyer. And we move now to George Dunoyer, not too many years younger, still very much in the early Victorian mold, but recognizably moving into Victorian times in a, fully fledged way. Great Denmark Street, not far from, say, the Hugh Lane Gallery. It's where the proprietary school was run by George Newnham Wright, and it's where Dunoyer was a pupil. And not very far away was Great Charles Street, where George Petrie lived, and where he had almost certainly not 4 wheelie bins outside his front door, but he had an office where the work of the topographical department of the Ordnance Survey was carried on. And immense amount of fascinating, material was brought to light in the kitchens of that house where they would sit. O'Curry, Eugene O'Curry, John O'Donovan, James Clarence Mangan, they would gather together in that house, and they would, gather together the place names for the Ordnance Survey and all the data that was being gathered, not least by George Dunoyer, who Petrie very quickly employed as a draftsman in the Ordnance Survey, dated 1835. And Dunoyer collects specimens of fungi, of apples, of roses, and draws them with great precision. This is all part of the mapping of Ireland. He's anxious to gather together information about the flora and fauna of the country. In due course, this work and the work of collecting the manuscripts and translating them becomes what you now can, broadly speaking, refer to today as Irish national identity. These are the people who are simply going through it and creating it. He went to the market and bought lots of apples in Belfast. He didn't know that they were mostly imported. And he drew them in great precision, and they're wonderful. But there was idealism, and sometimes misplaced idealism in this too. They weren't necessarily getting it perfect, but they did get it very, very right in so many ways. Portlock, Joseph Ellison Portlock, published in 1843 this book, and this book was based upon the work of the Ordnance Survey, and then it marks, its publication also marks the founding of the Geological Survey of Ireland. So that's published in Dublin and in London. And it's 500 pages, and it's a magnificent book. There had been nothing like this, I think, in Britain or Ireland. Portlock's Geology of the County of Londonderry and parts of Tyrone and Fermanagh. It was so precise, so exacting, and it was fully based upon all those principles of science that were underpinning that rapidly changing, developing science of geology. Dunoyer did the drawings for that book, and on the right you see like a trilobite, you see fossils, where you found plants in rock. It was very often carboniferous, and if you found enough plants in rock that was carboniferous, and if the plants might amount to 20 meters in height and kilometers in length and extent, you could have coal, because coal is compressed plants. So England's industrial might had been fueled by coal, and it was hoped that Ireland could experience an economic boom if they could discover coal. In the event, coal was discovered in small quantities and not of any great economic benefit, although some of the coal mines did go a reasonable distance. So it was a great disappointment. But the Geological Survey was a real attempt to look at that, but inter alia, in looking for those carboniferous rocks, in looking for those evidence of plants from 300 million years ago, or I think. They were also finding fossils, and the fossils were changing the way people thought about the world. So 20 years after Portlock's book is published, Dunoyer drew amphibious fossils that were discovered in a mine in Jarrow in County Kilkenny. And those were detailed and drawn by Dunoyer, and a local geologist from Kilkenny gave a paper at the Geological Society. And then the professor from Trinity College heard about them, and he brought over Thomas Huxley from England. And then they got together and they developed another paper and they got all the credit. Well, I tell you, there's still rumblings about that. And the jarrow plant fossils are in Trinity College and in the National Museum. And they redefined the people's knowledge of the evolution of living creatures on the earth, because they were amphibious creatures and they had not previously been discovered. They were of immense importance. So William Brownrigg, the local geologist from Kilkenny, we will remember tonight for his discovery, because he knew exactly what he was discovering. But Huxley was no slouch, and Huxley was a great Darwinian. And Huxley, you remember Huxley, he was in that famous debate in the museum building in Oxford with Bishop Wilberforce, who was resolutely anti-Darwinian. And the bishop said to Huxley, "On what side are you descended from apes, Mr. Huxley, on your mother's or your father's?" And that was the debate. And the dons of Oxford were very much against this new Darwinianism. They saw it as secular, anti-church, you know, they saw it as a travesty of biblical beliefs and so on. Well, as we know now, the Darwinians had it broadly right. And the age of living creatures on the earth was being pushed back and back and back and back and back. So now you're back in, 300 million years BC. And so it's, but Huxley came to Dublin and Wright and himself did a good job. And when he came to Dublin, Huxley, he would have seen this building, which is the museum building in Trinity College, which is a lovely Cork connection, because it's designed by Woodward and Dean. And Dean, of course, is a Cork architect. And the carvings on it are done by the Shea brothers, who are these brilliantly talented stone carvers from Ballyhooly in County Cork, who also, when word of this building reached England, and Woodward and Dean were immediately asked by John Ruskin to come to Oxford and design the museum building there, the Shea brothers went too. And the Shea brothers carved those amazing, wonderful foliage columns and capitals and arches on the museum building in Oxford, just as I had done here in Dublin in 1853. But when the dons of Oxford saw these creatures, including monkeys, they came out and said, "Stop this work." They felt it was the embodiment in stone of the doctrine of Darwinism. This is a slightly romantic tale. And the Shea brothers were told to get down off the scaffolding. And before they got down off the scaffolding, they carved parrots and owls representing the dons of Oxford on the arches, then took down this. And if you go there today, you will see the parrots and the owls representing the dons of Oxford. It's slightly fanciful there. In fact, the money ran out. That's why the scaffolding had to be taken down. Ruskin ended up paying the Shea brothers himself. But it was on the basis of this building, the museum building in Trinity. And this building is so connected with geology that every single column inside it was made from a different type of marble from a different quarry in Ireland. So this building was intended to be an embodiment in stone of Ruskinian principles, as embodied in the 7 lamps of architecture, Venetian Gothic brought to Ireland, but also then celebrating the geological history of the country itself. And this was something that Dunoyer was very much part of. He was never a university man, though. He never got a degree. So Dunoyer, throughout his life, remained as a journeyman. He remained as a draftsman. When he sold his paintings in the Royal Hibernian Academy, his prices were always in pounds, shillings, and pence, not in guineas. And these drawings that he did extended through antiquarian. This is one of those flasks, from Canterbury. If you're pilgrims going to Canterbury, brought this little flask with Thomas a Becket on it, and they filled it from that trough of water into which the brains of Thomas a Becket had been put, and it was constantly topped up with water. So if you filled it with water, you were getting a little piece of the brains of Thomas a Becket, whose brains had been spilled out on the floor of that cathedral by the knights sent down by which king?
Henry II.
Well done. And the same man who, when he came to Ireland, was so conscious of his own endangered position because he was about to be excommunicated by the Pope. And when he got to Ireland, Strongbow and the others knew how vulnerable Henry II was, and they struck a very hard deal with him, saying, we'll take Leinster, we'll take Wexford, we'll take thing, and yeah, we'll swear fealty to you, but we will be the Anglo-Norman barons of Ireland, and our respect to you as King of England will be titular in a way. So this was the dynamics of the time. And of course, I think we've had occasion to mention fake news, but we won't go too deeply into it. But this bell with patrizi inscribed in it, okay, is a fake. The bell is authentic, but the notion that it was St. Patrick's bell is really not tenable. And I'm going to move quickly along, as I've done before, looking at these antiquities. And then when the Ordnance Survey is wound up, Dunoyer ends up working again with Petrie on the Irish Penny Journal in 1840, and that's an engraving. You see in Dunoyer's sketchbooks such wonderful insights into everyday life in Ireland. No other artist produces these marvelously free and brisk, crisp sketches. You see in his tower houses that he's drawn. This is near Lucan. There is nothing left of it today. This is the only record of what was quite a substantial historic building. When Halls of Ireland is published, Dunoyer produces images for it, including some which celebrate his own Huguenot ancestry, which was very important to him because the Dunoyer family are French Huguenots who come to Ireland, and they're middle class and they're working hard and they're teaching and working in various enterprises. And yet they are sort of of Ireland, but not at the same time. And that gives George Dunoyer a considerable degree of independence in looking at Ireland. But he also always tracks. You see, this is Colonel Lequel, who was one of the military leaders, under William at the Battle of the Boyne. Then when the Ordnance Survey stops, Dunoyer becomes a teacher at the newly founded College of St. Columba, which is housed in Stack Allen House in 1843. It's a post-Williamite house built by Hamilton, who was one of the victorious generals at the Battle of the Boyne, and was used in 1843 to house a new public school in Ireland called the College of St. Columba, built for the express purpose of inhibiting the tendency of Irish landowning gentry to send their children to be educated in England. They were all being sent to Eton and Harrow and Marlborough and so on. This school was intended to give a space where the children of Irish aristocracy and the wealthiest classes could be educated. But Dunoyer, as teacher there, is marvelous. He depicts humble buildings and the surroundings throughout his career, and Petrie to a degree, but Petrie was sort of sidled into doing all these grand houses. Dunoyer seems to have resisted it, and so what Dunoyer really liked were these scenes of buildings that were on their last legs, or ships. Indeed, HMS Ajax in Kingston Harbour, a ship actually that was on its last legs, a ship literally disintegrating. And that was something that just seemed to attract his imagination. His work as a geologist is pretty important, as well as his work as an artist, but they combine together in these lithographs, which he produced, George Dunoyer, you see, for Beat Jukes' Popular Physical Geology. Very, very, well thought of books in the 19th century and good today still. Joints in the lower limestone railway cutting Malahide. The railways in the 1840s are going out from Dublin, up towards Belfast, down towards Cork. And we've mentioned them before in relation to the transformation of the landscape and the way in which You know, people were getting access to different parts of the country. Tourism, at every point where the railhead terminated, you had the Great Southern Hotel in Killarney, and you had one, you know, in Sligo and so on. So these Great Southern Hotels were part of that whole enterprise of tourism. As the railways went through the countryside, the cuttings that were made were fantastic in terms of the information that they gave on geology. And XIXe, who led the Ordnance Geological Survey from 1850 onwards for about 20 years, and XIXe was incredibly dedicated to the work of exploring the geology, the original watercolor upon which that lithograph is based. Other textbooks, again by Beat XIXe, manual for students, much of it based upon Irish material. A quarry near Mallow in County Cork, you see there, in a chapter entitled, rather wonderfully, Quadrangular Joints. And this original watercolor in the Geological Survey of Ireland still today by Dunoyer, recording that same formation. Baginbun Head in County Wexford, again from Beat XIXe's popular geology, a marvellous evocation of the actual point, and this is interesting about Dunoyer. Baginbun, which he chose, is where the Normans landed, exactly. And again, you see, so you'll find that although he's going throughout Ireland, travelling on foot very often, or by boat, or wherever he could, he's exploring, you know, aspects of Irish history and heritage as he goes. He's also exploring the geology, and he loved these glacial erratics, these giant boulders that had just been left on the landscape by the retreating glaciers, because in those days it was only beginning to be understood how much glaciation and the Ice Age had affected the Irish landscape. All those round-topped mountains had previously been jagged before the ice had simply rubbed them smooth. And this, you see, rubbed smooth by glaciers, giant glaciers, the entire of Ireland covered in, you know, 0.5 kilometre of ice. There we go, it's all ahead of us. And this is Glendalough. And those glacial erratics, you see, littering the landscape. Nowadays they're gone because the farmers have removed them all as an obstruction to efficient agriculture. So a landscape like that probably just simply doesn't exist. Through the medium of woodblock engraving, and this is a woodblock with one of Dunoyer's drawings on it, there, you know, the information that he recorded with his sketchbooks is transferred, and with his faithful friend, Mr. Buff, he travelled the length and breadth of Ireland. I think we would estimate that he produced well over 5,000–6,000 drawings, which are in the Geological Survey of Ireland, the Royal Society of Antiquaries, the Royal Art Academy, the Botanic Gardens, and National Museum. Most of them have never before been seen. These are coming from books, you know, that have been in the cupboards, into which they were placed. When he retired, when he died, in fact, in 1869, he didn't retire. He died on the job. And so these have been there ever since. Hookhead Lighthouse in County Wexford, and Coastline in County Waterford. Even though he's interested in old red sandstone and the geology, this is a superb watercolors, and they're full and fresh and delightful. Even, you know, they're early 19th century, but they don't have that stylized, because he's looking at the landscape from a scientific perspective. In this case, a Corrie Lake in County Waterford called Cumshingon, and the debris left by the glacier there on the left, but he includes a hunting party also in the same image. And it's at this point, when he's using the field sheets, that he begins to get very interesting indeed, because he puts little vignettes into those field sheets. And so you actually have now a work of art that includes a 6-inch map upon which he's using text, upon which he's imposing vignettes, and then also cross-sections. So these are works of art that are very much in tune with the kind of contemporary sensibility, I think, because they're operating at so many different levels of information, of inspiration, and so on. And look at this, Oyster Haven, the 6-inch map, and he puts a vignette into it of a sailing boat, because he was a keen sailor, and he's got the sovereign rock there. There is a sovereign rock there, so, and a little vignette there. So he's operating at all these different levels, even with the sovereign rocks within the sail of the boat. And simple cross sections too, not so simple to work out what's going on, but that's Arklow, and that's what the geologists were interested in. A quarry in Waterford where they're hacking away at slate to use as roofing material, and hoping, I guess, that the sandstone on top is not going to fall upon them. He always depicted people working, and this again is at variance with the 18th century bucolic tradition in Ireland, where people were very rarely depicted. And he brings out from the landscape, through slight exaggeration, in this case probably, you know, using the brush and the eye of a geologist, he brings out the stratification of incredible rock formations throughout, many of them in Wicklow, Wexford, Waterford, and now to Kerry and West Cork, with a very distinctive drawing style too. And there he is in his boat with Mr. Buff, bowling along. Sailing ships form a part of his repertoire, and often they're ships in danger or under hazard. And the excitement of people collecting seaweed after a storm is brilliantly captured in this watercolor, 1849, but it could be 20th century. It is very little of the flavor of the 19th century. His vignettes then of cockle pickers on Sandymouth Strand, you know, which could have been so stereotypical in the eyes of other artists, are full and fresh, and he's an eyewitness to all sorts of things. There are thousands of these drawings in the Royal Society of Antiquaries. You're seeing 5 drawings, or 6 out of 5,000. And it's an encyclopedic view. You know, even you know, in the 1840s, 50s, he's as interested in natural history as he was when he was back working with the Ordnance Survey. Right on cue, the PowerPoint has now decided. And as we're pretty much at the last slide in any case, I will, and it's 10 to 9, I'm going to wind up tonight's talk. Just to suffice to say that the last 2 or 3 images are of his work in Antrim, where he went, having been appointed district surveyor. And in 1869, after just 2 years or so in County Antrim, he died of fever. His daughter had died of the same fever, scarlet fever, the day before. It was part of the, you know, the hazard of life in Ireland in the 19th century, where disease carried away as many people, you know, cholera and so on, as did famine. And in terms of his life, what you have to reflect upon is the, I suppose, notion that there he was at the forefront of so much scientific positive energy, of research, of collecting data, of mapping, and the railways going out, and the museums being built, and the Royal Art Academy, and the Society of Antiquaries, and these incredible scientific advances which were taking place throughout the country. There weren't little advances either. The steam turbine engine was invented by Parsons from Parsonstown Castle. They were not idle, you know, these incredible, you know, motivated people who lived in many of these houses. Some, of course, were you know, no credit to any age, but in terms of many of these, they were extraordinarily dedicated, and like the Dunsaneys, towards, you know, bringing back Irish history to, you know, to life, to commemorate it and to immortalize it. So that's what you have. We've looked at George Petrie, we've looked at his pupil George Dunoyer. His death in 1869 is really the, you know, the doorstep, isn't it, into the late 19th century Celtic twilight, and all those poems and plays and books that, you know, created Ireland as this internationally recognized, slightly tragic country, with this so many unhappy histories, but with all of this poetry. And these were the people who literally laid the bedrock for that, almost literally in their case, but through simply gathering the material together into libraries, academies, archives, and so on, analyzing it, translating it, and taking it out of the realm of Charles Valency and putting it into the realm of the modern scientific approach. And that work, as you know, it's continued really ever since. It was given a great boost by the arrival of François Henri to Ireland in the 1930s. And François Henri was a pupil of the director of the Muséum National d'Archéologie, which is at Saint-Germain-en-Laye. And she trained there. And the system that they had developed at Saint-Germain-en-Laye was a system that she used then to produce her 3-volume book on Christian art in Ireland, which is still a definitive text. François Henri is, celebrated in Irish art history in the 20th century and today, and so she continued that work that in the 19th century, Thomson from Denmark had brought to Ireland when he visited the 3-age system, Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. So Thomson develops that in Denmark. He's in Dublin very quickly, and the museum and the Royal Irish Academy is catalogued according to that principle. So this is a culture that's very much in touch with in the 19th century and through into the 20th with contemporary European thinking on these matters. So there we go. We leave the shark. Yes, a happy note, perhaps not for the shark. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.